Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Go All the Way, a literary appreciation for power pop. Edited by Paul Myers and S.W. Lauden. Contributions by Heather Havrilesky, Michael Chabon, Larry Karaszewski, Dave Holmes, David Yaffe, Annie Zaleski, and Carrie Corrigan. Read by Keith Sellon-Wright. Power pop at its purest is the music of hit records that miss. Michael Chabon. Introduction by Paul Myers and S.W. Lauden. Paul here. For me, explaining the meaning of power pop is a little like explaining what love is. You know it when you feel it, but damn if it's not different for everyone who experiences it. As a songwriter, I've always had a special place in my heart for what I have defined as power pop, and it has always made me feel young and excited, swept up in the euphoric spell of the eternal now, and it's Friday or Saturday night, you just got paid, that girl from school just saw you at the mall, and the limitless potential for adventure is laid out before you like a chiming Rickenbacker guitar. Years ago, Rare Bird asked me to contribute a short story to their literary anthology of prog rock stories, Yes is the Answer, and I wrote a very personal story about my teenage pals and I going record shopping and working out life in the suburbs. After that book turned out so well, I went to Tyson at Rare Bird with an idea. How about a similar anthology, but this time about power pop? Tyson liked the idea, and we soon found out that Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and screenwriter Michael Chabon, my neighbor in Berkeley, California, was as head over heels in love with power pop as I was. We were off to the races, so I put out a back-channel word-of-mouth search to find other authors, journalists, and musicians who might have a power pop-themed essay in them. That took time, too long if you ask me, and I had to put the whole thing on hold for a couple of years while I researched and wrote One Dumb Guy, my book about the comedy troupe Kids in the Hall. Then, as I was finishing that one, a wonderful thing happened. Unbeknownst to me, S.W. Lauden had also approached Tyson with a similar idea. So, Tyson put us together to combine our visions for this book. I'll let Steve take it from here. Steve here. After publishing the Greg Salem punk rock PI trilogy with Rare Bird, Tyson and I were looking for my next project. With dueling backgrounds in music and writing, moving into the world of rock journalism and essays made sense. We were batting ideas around when Tyson mentioned a power pop collection that was on the back burner. I knew it was a perfect fit. I've loved power pop in many of its mutations since I first heard Cheap Trick as a kid, and Paul was the perfect partner in crime. No matter how far my tastes stray into other genres, killer hooks, driving backbeats, and strong melodies always suck me back in. I'm thrilled to be part of a collection that brings together so many talented writers and passionate music fans in celebration of power pop. This is not a textbook. In some cases, the writing isn't strictly journalism so much as personal essays and shared experiences. So while this book doesn't claim to be the definitive anything, we have sincerely tried to bring in as many different takes, experiences, and voices on power pop that we could stitch together before our print deadline closed in, and we think we ended up with a fascinating range of stories. Like a picture, each writer's take on the subject is worth 1,000, actually around 2,000 words, and we think we've taken a pretty cool snapshot here. We close with the immortal words of one of the key architects of the subgenre, The Who's Pete Townsend, who wrote in May of 1967, "Power pop is what we play, what the Small Faces used to play, and the kind of pop the Beach Boys played in the days of fun, 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 which I preferred." Analog Anthems by Nancy Rommelmann. At first, the phone is really not yours. You're 10, you don't call anyone. You know your own and maybe your grandmother's phone number by heart. Then you're 11, and after your mother goes to sleep, or maybe when she's just not home, It's the mid-70s and parents are not around much. They're doing group therapy and having affairs. You call 555-1212, which tells you the time. It is 9:22 and 10 seconds. It is 9:22 and 20 seconds. And when that gets boring, you switch over to a woman's recorded voice saying what the weather will be in New York City that day and the next. You call her a lot. There's something soothing about it. But it's also about the phone in your hand, a lifeline to the outside, though to what outside you are not quite sure. By 12, you do sort of know, not in your head so much as in your body. The racing in your chest and the heat between your legs have no place to go. Then they do. The shivers are singing the exact sensations in teen line, pouring all of it into the telephone. And it's right, 'cause you called me yesterday, and I had so much to say, and the sun don't have to shine, 'cause my heart's on the teen line. The song is pure pleading and release, and makes you feel as though you are being slammed around and running at the same time. Then you're 13, and boys start saying things to you on the street. They say you're pretty, in English, in Spanish. 3 boys you've never seen before ask you and your friend for your phone numbers. No one's ever done this, and it seems a reasonable exchange. You hand your number to Junior and Tiger and Roach, and like that, they're calling. The phone rings, and your mother asks, "Who are these boys?" You barely speak into the phone. You're giddy just to hold it, to hear the boys' voices, and then only Junior's voice, his soft Puerto Rican accent in your ear, and days later, his mouth on yours. You've read, probably in your mother's copy of The Joy of Sex, that touching the back of a man's neck makes him something? Happy? Anyway, you do it, and Junior, who is 15, springs up from the bed. "Don't do that," he says. And you think that was immediate. But it is also the last time you and Junior kiss. He tells you he doesn't trust himself around you, that you are too young. The phone, which is in the kitchen, rings later in the week. Your mother does not allow phone calls during dinner, and anyway, she's had enough of these boys calling. But it's not a boy. It's a girl, and she's screaming something that turns out to be, "Your daughter's a whore." This girl, it seems, has grown up with the boys who have been calling you. She calls again the next night, which is so disturbing to your mother that she gets your father to come over and deal with it, and while it's a little terrifying to hear the girl's voice reverberating through the phone, screaming that you are a whore, you also think all you did was touch one boy's neck, that you're pretty far from, for a good time, call. You have never been in a man's restroom and have no idea if things like this are written on the wall. You know about it only from the 8675309 Jenny song, which you're not sure you like. It's catchy, but it also feels tricky, like a song boys might guffaw at, boys you wouldn't want to hang around with anymore. You are 14, 15, and music is changing. You won't know until later that the Ramones and Patti Smith and Blondie are playing over on the Bowery, but you are listening to them, especially Parallel Lines, Debbie Harry's Jersey accent full on in Hanging on the Telephone. You can see the whole scene. See her in the phone booth, the one across the hall, pleading and flirting, and also defiant. You picture her kicking a trash can if she doesn't get her way. And this is how you feel these days. You never go home. The city is yours. You meet other boys. And when Harry sings, "Oh, I Can't Control Myself," it's like she's giving you permission. Then you're 21. You live in a railroad flat in Brooklyn, and you are lonely for a boy 100 miles away. A boy who is in your head all the time, but you don't call him. You're shy and afraid. But one night you do call. You get his answering machine, which are kind of new things. You're surprised he has one. Also, hearing his voice is like getting warm syrup poured into you. But his voice also makes you feel lonely. To have him at this remove, a voice in a box. The Replacements sing about this. Paul Westerberg sings, "How do you say I miss you" to an answering machine. He sings, "How do you say I'm lonely" to an answering machine. You say neither of these things. You leave no message. You hang up and might have called back to hear his voice again, but star 69 has fucked that up. You are older. Phones change. They have less heroic power. Previously, phones did not belong to you. They belonged to a household. They were on the street. You ducked into phone booths to have an illicit conversation. You could close yourself in one and cry. Now, a phone is yours. You hold it in your hand. You play solitary games on it. You take naked pictures of yourself and text them to the man you love. Each time you do, you are thankful the technology did not exist when you were a teenager. You don't believe in the illusion that anything you do with a phone is private. And you miss that about the telephone. Plugging in an extra long cord so you could pull the phone into your bedroom, into the bathroom, and close the door, and whisper into it, or simply listen to it ringing on the other end, the hope that someone might pick up like a bubble, like stopping time, an interlude in which to practice what you will say. Hello, how are you? Have you been all right through all those lonely, 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 lonely nights? That's what I'd say. I'd tell you everything if you pick up that telephone. Jeff Lynne of ELO is singing Telephone Line, his voice a galaxy away, a satellite signaling for one person only, and the signal is not received. You don't know if you can get through the song. It's crushing you. Then the harmonies and emotions sweep you up until you are cradled inside the satellite, Lynne singing, "I'll just sit tight, through shadows of the night, let it ring forevermore." And you are lulled. What choice do you have? By the belief that as long as the phone is ringing, it might be picked up yet. It is last month, and you are in Iowa City for a conference. There's an opening party, lots of writers in a bar, and you are drinking a Manhattan. You drink 2 of them, and then it's midnight, and you don't want any more writer talk. You want to go outside and walk around this new place. You have company. The man you are in love with has given you playlists for Spotify. You have never had music on your phone, and now you do, and take pleasure in it. For the music, sure, and also because it lets you spend time with this man when you are away from him. You have just put the earbuds in your ears when a girl pitches forward from the bar. She's maybe 22, wearing a skirt the size of an album cover and 5-inch ankle breakers on which she cannot walk one step without, "Whoa!" You don't want to scare her, so you gently approach and say, "May I help you get home?" She verily falls into you and says, "Yes, please." You tell her she's going to have to direct you, that you've never been to Iowa City before. "Okay," she says, and off you go, down an alley, up some streets. You have no idea whether Amanda, she's told you her name, and also says, sorry, a lot, is leading you to where she lives. But you're happy this girl is not going to maybe crack open her head on a curb or get caught in a rain that is really starting to come down hard. Here, she says. And you get her up to an apartment building where another student holds open the front door, and Amanda disappears inside. No goodbye. And you get the earbuds back in and crank Starry Eyes by the Records. You can't believe you missed this when it came out in 1979, and also how it is making you feel as you did back then when you listened to Teen Line, like being grabbed and running at the same time. You hit replay and disappear into the lyrics. I don't want to argue. I ain't gonna budge. Won't you take this number down before you call up the judge? I don't want to argue. There's nothing to say. Get me out of your starry eyes and be on your way. Which you think are about some window-dressing girls getting told they need to scram, but which you later learn is about the band's lazy-ass manager. The narrative hooks you, but what keeps you half running in the opposite direction of your hotel is the power pop. How hard the band is banging it out. And you are so grateful for this. And while an hour from now you'll be laying your clothes on every available heating vent so you won't be in front of an audience the next morning in half-wet clothes, which you wind up doing nevertheless, right now, this song has everything you want. You let yourself get drenched and revolve inside it. Nancy Rommelmann is a journalist and author. Her work is featured in the Wall Street Journal, LA Weekly, the New York Times, Reason, and other publications. Her most recent book is To the Bridge, a true story of motherhood and murder, the story of Amanda Stott Smith, who in 2009 dropped her 2 young children from a bridge in Portland, Oregon. She is the author previously of the novel The Bad Mother, The Queens of Montague Street, a digital memoir of growing up in Brooklyn Heights in the 1970s, the story collection Transportation, and Destination Gacy, an e-book about her visit and interview with serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Rommelmann lives in New York City and Portland, Oregon. More at nancyromm.com. Follow on Twitter at nancyromm. On the Road to Power Pop by Justin Fielding. As an independent filmmaker with a lifelong love of Beatlesque music, I reached out to several of my favorite power pop artists for help brightening my ornery 2011 slacker comedy inventory. To my delight, many of the genre's greats agreed to let me place their recordings in the film. Some years later, it occurred to me that, beyond using power pop music on a soundtrack, there should be a documentary that tells the story of this underappreciated subspecies of rock and roll. In 2015, I began traversing the U.S. and a bit of Canada to interview dozens of power pop aficionados, musicians, writers, record executives, and promoters. Along the way to making the film, working title The Power Pop Movie, I have interacted with many astute power pop fans on social media and interviewed a few notables among them as well. Here I'm going to relate major themes I've observed across interviews with approximately 200 subject area experts, insights, commonalities, and great debates. I began each interview with the foundational question: what is power pop? For musicians, this also connects the questions of whether they've been called power pop, and if so, how they feel about being so labeled. For all, it was the beginning of a discussion about power pop's history and fortunes. For the most part, people define power pop as music that stands on the shoulders of 1960s greats. In particular, music from approximately 1970 on that bears telltale influences from the Beatles, first and foremost, along with the Beach Boys, Byrds, Kinks, and/or Who. A minority opinion is that power pop includes those forefathers themselves, and sometimes even their influences, such as Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, or the Everly Brothers. This is but one of many matters on which there's considerable divergence among the power pop cognoscenti. Variations on Judge Potter Stewart's I know it when I see it, regarding defining pornography, are often articulated in trying to nail down precisely what power pop is. My idea for Raspberries was to form a band that had the power of The Who, the harmonies of the Beach Boys or the Beatles, and the melodies that were present in all these great songs of the 60s. No one was doing that, and so my idea was to go completely against the trend. Eric Carmen, Raspberries, the Power Pop Movie interview. When you hear it. The elements of power pop most often cited in my interviews include tunefulness, bright melodies and rich harmonies, jangle, such as the ringing tones of 12-string Rickenbacker guitars, concision, tight songs with instrumentation played to the song as opposed to jammy or flashy solos. Lyrics that counterpoint happy-sounding music with yearning or melancholy. For some, power pop must, by definition, be powerful. It is typified by 2 guitars, bass, and drums, and is often amped up more than in the Beatles' day. However, many of the artists customarily deemed power pop practitioners write and record ballads, include keyboards at times, or otherwise don't fit neatly into the power framework. A common answer to this conundrum is that the power can come from the impact of a well-turned song and performance, and not necessarily from aggressive playing. There's always been a sharp contrast in power pop between the melody and the darkness of the lyrical content. Gary Cleave, Shoes, the Power Pop Movie Interview. What's in a Name? A number of the interviewees recalled reading The Who's Pete Townshend's coinage of the term power pop in a 1967 interview that appeared in New Musical Express in England and stateside in Hit Parader. Scant years after Beatlemania, Townshend decried the fancification of rock music in that Summer of Love era. He likened The Who's single Pictures of Lily to the earlier Beatles and Beach Boys sounds, while those bands had moved on to integrating classical and progressive elements and exotic instrumentation layered in via studio magic. No matter that Townshend was about to embark on the elaborate rock operas Tommy, Lifehouse, which morphed into Who's Next, and Quadrophenia, or that he'd pioneered such forms in his mini-rock opera, A Quick One While He's Away, a few months before. That aesthetic divide exists in power pop to this day. Some power pop artists keep both feet planted in the early Beatles and Beach Boys ethos, while others are influenced by the whole gamut of their styles, being as inspired by Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Pet Sounds as much as, if not more than, their formative tunes about dating, dancing, and driving. It took a decade before Townshend's coinage gained much currency. In 1977, the group Pez Band was among the first to use power pop in its marketing. Around the same time, the publications Trouser Press and Bop began to use it to categorize mid to late 1970s bands that kept 1960s musical values alive, if somewhat underground, during the heyday of disco and punk. Artists who were gaining cult, if not bigger, popularity in the power pop boom of the latter half of the 1970s included Dwight Twilley, Shoes, 2020, and Paul Collins's The Beat. By most accounts, Cheap Trick, now members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, is the most sustainably successful group regularly described as power pop. As the term became relatively established, similarly influenced artists from the earlier part of the decade were retroactively labeled power pop. These include Badfinger, Raspberries, Big Star, Emmett Rhodes, and Something Anything era Todd Rundgren. It's quite possible that as soon as we were yesterday's news, the very short attention span of the record company executive turned off to the idea of making those other bands the successes that they very well could have or should have been. Burton Avere, The Knack, the Power Pop Movie Interview. A New Hope. In 1979, power pop reached its commercial zenith. Capitol Records released LA-based band The Knack's single, My Sharona, and album Get the Knack, and both topped the charts for weeks on end. In the wake of this breakthrough for the genre, numerous other power pop bands were signed to major label deals. Alas, the record industry's enthusiasm for power pop was extremely short-lived. A powerful reaction against the Knack's meteoric success, termed by some as the Knacklash, and the growing commercial acceptance of the hipper, more dance-oriented new wave and the emerging synth-fueled new romantic sounds, spelled a quick industry retrenchment from the earnest, retro-styled melodicism of power pop. Artists who were signed when power pop momentarily looked to be the next big thing were dropped by their labels almost immediately. A notable aspect of the Knacklash was that the band was held to account for photographs evocative of famous Beatles poses. This is just one of several backlashes against bands heralded as the New Beatles. Years prior to the Knacks' emergence, this new Beatles curse could be seen in the fate of Badfinger. Among the first and best-loved power pop bands, Badfinger was, for better and worse, widely seen as baby Beatles. Their connections went well beyond stylistic, as they collaborated in numerous ways with Beatles members, and their first releases were on the Beatles' own Apple Records. It was, of course, flattering to be considered a protege of, and even heir apparent to, the most adored rock band in history. But it was also a shadow from which it was near impossible to emerge intact. Badfinger wrote and recorded some of the most indelible power pop hits, songs that could have more than held their own on a Beatles album. But most any power pop fan will avow they didn't receive the commercial and critical rewards that their extraordinary talents warranted. Badfinger's story took incredibly calamitous turns, with two members taking their own lives. The tragic dimension of the effervescent-sounding genre of power pop has affected all too many of its artists, a topic covered perceptively and poignantly in Michael Chabon's Tragic Magic essay, which appears in this volume. Even where the outcomes haven't been quite as devastating, power pop has been a challenging road for most of its practitioners. And for every Badfinger or Raspberries who garnered a handful of hits, there are dozens of worthy power pop bands that never cracked the charts, especially as the 1970s gave way to the 1980s and beyond. In the years since, previously established and new artists have produced power pop music. The genre seemed to be getting a new lease in the early 1990s, with glistening records by Matthew Sweet, Jellyfish, and the Posies, and small labels like Not Lame issued scads of power pop gems in the CD era. But grunge and other sounds won the day, and power pop again fell short of becoming a household name. Every so often a hit that smacks of power pop, like Fountains of Wayne's Stacy's Mom, does break through. All along, power pop musicians toil away at making radio-friendly records, but radio has rarely reciprocated. All this leads to the central mysteries of power pop. How did the musical values that were so beloved and successful for the Beatles at all fall out of fashion? What's not to like about shimmering songs with beautiful melodies and harmonies? Why, in the face of continued commercial failure and cultural disregard, do artists continue to create power pop music? The Power Pop movie explores these questions in depth. When you get compared to the Beatles, that's the kiss of death, because if you're not as big as the Beatles, you must not be any good. Bun E. Carlos, Cheap Trick, The Power Pop Movie Interview. Power pop, moi? Music industry people, many of whom personally love power pop, have termed the appellation a kiss of death. To them it confers negatives that outweigh the positive associations with the charms of 1960s-style pop, and with a handful of ear-tickling hits from the genre itself. Among the reasons some artists and labels hesitate to apply the term: association with catchy music that doesn't catch on with the public. In fact, when power pop-oriented or power pop-adjacent artists gain marketplace success, by convention they cease to be called power pop, or perhaps commercially benefited by never being so categorized. See Tom Petty, Americana, REM, Alternative, Oasis, Britpop, and several popular artists from the late 1970s who were marketed as new wave or punk, but could well have been classified as power pop. Lack of edgy macho cred. Some conflate power pop with cloying bubblegum music, and somehow following in the footsteps of the Beatles and the Beach Boys lacks the venerability of, say, following in the footsteps of Robert Johnson, Patsy Cline, Bob Dylan, or the Velvet Underground. A genre propagated by studying hook-laden records via headphones doesn't have the cachet of those whose backstories are honky-tonk roadhouses and hipster dives. Lack of recognition and infrastructure. Other specialty genres, like blues and folk, have clubs, record store sections, and radio shows that cater to their fans, and even non-fans likely have some awareness of those genres' existence. I've heard it said that the only people who have heard of power pop.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?